We are live.
Okay. I'll call this meeting to order. And first order of business is introductions. I'm Elaine Barrett. I'm the chair.
Kevin Harrison, I'm a member of the board.
Dolly Hurdle, the director of elections.
Homer Ashby, I'm a member of the board.
Judson.
Judson Higley, voting equipment technician.
Annabelle Smith, paralegal.
Rick Stevens, I'm the county attorney.
And I'm Michelle Horn, I'm the assistant county attorney.
And we have Karen. You want to introduce yourself and say what you're doing with us?
Karen Newcomb, acting secretary.
Okay, and gentlemen, if you will introduce yourselves now for the record.
Peter Shea, and everyone except the county attorneys know me already. I represent the Alamance County Democratic Party.
So,
My name is Philip Adkins. I'm a volunteer attorney. Philip is with 1L. Last name is A-D-K-I-N-S. I actually live about half a mile away from Alamance County in Chatham County. Graduated from Williams, so I'm almost full circle. And I'm here to represent Jefferson Griffin campaign.
okay, thank you. You, sir?
Hi, I'm Neil Wolgan. That's N-E-A-L. Last name is W-O-L-G-I-N. And I am attorney for the rates.
Thank you, gentlemen.
How are you?
I'm good, are you?
The first thing I want to do is just review our initial meeting. Alamance County Board of Elections held the election protest preliminary consideration on November 21st. We were advised by the state board that the protest established probable cause to advance to a hearing. So with that, we move to today's meeting. And today is the evidentiary hearing. At this hearing, the Alamance County Board of Elections will provide Judge Griffin or his representative the opportunity to present his evidence. Additionally, Justice Riggs or her representative will have the opportunity to provide evidence to their own. The board will also hear testimony from county board staff as to the contents of official county board records pertaining to the voters whose ballots have been called into question by the protest. This hearing will be recorded by Karen and by our mechanical Al here, and the full record of this hearing will be preserved. Only one protest is pending in Alamance County, the one regarding deceased registered voters, because the State Board of Elections has taken jurisdiction over the other two protests statewide. At the end of this hearing, the Alamance County Board of Elections will first vote on its findings of fact and conclusions of law in a written order. To the members of this board, Kevin and Homer and myself, it's our duty to make findings of fact about the one identified protest addressing 6 contested ballots. Those findings must be based exclusively on the evidence and on matters officially noticed. After the board votes on its findings of fact, we will vote on the conclusions of law listed in NC General Statute 163-182.10 or .10 or put, I think that's it. I'm not a lawyer. We may dismiss the protest. The general rule is that dismissal occurs if there is a lack of substantial evidence of any violation, irregularity, or misconduct sufficient to cast doubt on the results of the election, or we may order that the protest and the county board's decision be sent to the State Board of Elections for action. Karen, point of order here. If you want this for your notes, that might be helpful. So, if there are no questions, we'll start with, let me make sure, Philip Adkins
Yes, ma'am.
for Judge Griffin.
Thank you. I understand y'all were busy last night. I'm going to try to make this short. The campaign got information from the state board about deceased voters in Alamance County. We do not know what happened here, and that's the reason we're here. You've got, I assume, the protest, and I'd like to have that marked as Exhibit 1. And in that protest, there's an affidavit that that lays out how we got the information about these voters. It may be helpful if we hear, I mean, now learned friend can speak, but if we hear from the county staff as to what happened between the time of the election and the canvass. That's the period of time that's in question. That's all I've got, unless you've got questions of me.
No questions. Mr. Walton?
It's Wolgin, W-O-L-G-I-N, most people do get it wrong. I don't have any new evidence to enter into the record. I just believe that you've seen a copy of the protest petition. Of course, you all have seen the attachments and the list of deceased voters. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, I guess. Who notified the board of the deceased individuals?
Who notified the board? That would, once I received the protest, that was our first notification of the deceased voters, and I emailed the board.
Okay. The voter, well, I guess I'll ask the question, have these voters been removed from the rolls?
Not currently.
Okay. What is the process for removing them? I'm looking at the list that has been presented by the Griffin campaign.
Up until election, we do what we call a weekly. We get reports from the state. We get felon lists, deceased voter lists, and we do a list maintenance. And we remove voters if all the criteria matches that voter exactly. We remove them. I will state that it has not been our practice in years past to do weekly list maintenance. That law just currently changed, and so we I think the last list maintenance that Karen, who handles our voter registration records, she did was the Wednesday prior to the election on Tuesday. And so we were not made aware of these deceased voters until the protest came through. Again, it just wasn't our practice to do weekly list maintenance in during election period. That was a new law that passed, and we were just unfamiliar with it, that it was to continue through election.
Actually, through and past.
Past election, yes, because it actually, we would do list maintenance up until the time we print the book, so our numbers would remain the same. We were just unaware that with this new law change that it was to continue through to canvass.
I don't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to get this read into the record. Is the only reason for asking the
And-
question.
And are we required to have county, you guys, the staff, sworn in under oath
So
prior to testimony?
yeah, I was going to suggest that we do that, especially if there's going to be, there's been a request for testimony as to the process, and I guess cross-examination now as to the questions that have not yet been asked. But it might be easier and better to clarify two things. Number one, there was an exhibit that was to be entered before, and I want to make sure we clarify what that document is and what it contains. And then also, I would suggest that before we go any further, it might be best to swear in the county staff and then perhaps conduct this a little bit more like a direct and cross-examination of the staff if you have questions.
Okay. I certainly don't want to slow things down, but you really should do it. What makes sense. What we're mostly concerned about is just making sure that everything's done on the record, and that whatever the process is followed, and that someone can look back at this and know how it was done. So.
Sure, understand. And we're happy to do that. Do you want to say anything else before we proceed with what I just suggested?
No.
Because the director was going to be allowed to give her testimony afterward evidence from documents and so forth. So if we could stop right at this point and have her and any other staff that maybe asked to testify.
Well, I think we can start with her since we know that she's going to be
Right.
asked to testify. We'll let her say what she will, and then we can ask whatever questions. But I also want to clarify once again exactly what documents we're going to be considering or asked to consider.
I'm asking you to consider the protest and mark it as exhibit 1, so it's on the record.
Okay. And again, that's the protest and what affidavits
The
attached.
affidavit is in the protest.
Okay. All right. Just make sure we have all the copy of that. Does everyone have a copy of that?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
I'll give it to you if you don't.
We have a copy. I want to make sure
Okay.
the board has a copy. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to
And
start
then
over or do you want to?
we don't need to start over. I wasn't sure how we were going to handle this, and I was kind of deferring to the chair. But Madam Chair, if you want to swear in your witness,
I just swear to tell the truth.
yes, you'll swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Okay, Don,
So
do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? I did.
Sorry, can I have the last name down?
Hurdle.
Hurdle.
Yes, sir.
Right. Let me just make the statement again. We're here in the Riggs campaign, or Riggs for our courts, just to state that we support the election system and the process. I want to make sure that is the point of coming here on today. You do have protest has been handed up, I assume. You'll have copies of that. I just want to note, and the protest itself is not the evidence. I know of no other evidence that has been entered. My esteemed colleague will certainly enter evidence if there is evidence to be entered on the matter, but you have to act on the facts and the evidence before you. So we went over the count. I asked him a follow-up question. Is there a basis to remove any of the 6 noted voters from withdraw their votes from the count?
does anyone have any objections to him asking questions at this point? I mean, she's been sworn in.
Yeah.
I
I think,
mean, I think it would be wisest for Dawn to speak to what transpired
Yes.
and how this sort of how we got here.
Mhm.
And then if you have follow-up questions after that, maybe that would be the best.
Sure.
Correct. Yeah, I think-
it goes in there.
I think that's best. She's been
Yeah.
sworn in. Let her
right,
give her testimony, and then if you have questions, we'll be happy to entertain questions from both
I
counsel.
agree.
Thank you.
Let me just make one point. The evidence is the affidavit that was submitted in the protest. It can be accepted by this board as evidence. You don't have to, but you can. But that would be the evidence that we've submitted as the affidavit that's in the protest.
do you have the affidavit handy? Can you go print it off?
That's the affidavit.
It's from Mr. Bonner.
And attached to that are the 6 voters in question.
And so you also need that to be admitted as well, like the whole packet.
The whole package.
Right. Yeah.
The whole package is exhibit 1.
And that's of just the protest about the dissent.
That's correct.
Before we enter into evidence, we need to find copies.
Right. That's what I was asking before. So does everyone have a copy? Does the board have a copy of what they are purporting to be, what they would enter?
I don't have a copy of everything.
I
including the
expected it
affidavit.
to be brought here.
It was emailed to
I don't
them,
have a
but we did.
physical
Okay.
copy,
Yeah.
but I
But you have access to
I
it.
have
That
access.
okay. As long as everyone on the board has as much access to that document as they want to have to it, then I think
We
you
all
just need to.
saw it.
Okay. Then you just need to consider whether or not
Okay.
you're going to allow that to be
Okay,
used
so
as
we can vote
evidence.
to accept that as their evidence.
Correct.
Do I hear a motion?
So move.
Second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So we have that as your evidence.
So now I would suggest that you allow Ms. Hurdle to give whatever testimony she'd want to give and maybe answer questions preemptively for the folks that are here. And then if they have additional questions after she's finished, then that would probably allow the board to
Yeah, I
entertain
think the
additional
testimony
questions.
will answer all these questions.
Okay. Do you want me to send it to you, please? Can y'all hear me? Please address the board. Okay, once we received the protest, at that point, I started doing a preliminary investigation. I went to the state board's website, to the intranet where they, do list the list maintenance each week now. Again, like I said previously, we recently, in the last several months, within the last 6 months, started doing this weekly prior to doing it monthly. And when we received this, we went through and I looked at, did make sure that the deceased voters on the list, we went back and verified that they did vote early. And then
All 6 of them?
all 6 of, well, 5 of them voted during early voting and 1 of them was absentee by mail.
Mhm.
And we had received their ballots and they were accepted. Then we just went through and the dates they did pass prior to one passed on election day, the other 5 passed prior to election day. Had we received this and or went to the intranet between election day and canvass, we could have presented that to the board and challenged those votes, the 5 votes, 5 of the 6 votes.
When did you, when were their deaths posted? I mean, when did they actually
When was this list available? On November 7th.
Okay, 2 days after?
And just for clarity's sake, when you're talking about the list that was posted, are you talking about what was sent in Judge Griffin's packet or the
Is the-
broader EHHS
Due to
list?
that, we went to the North Carolina State Board of Elections intranet, and they, that's where they list, the Department of Human and Health Services. They list their weekly death list there for people within North Carolina.
And do you know, I guess this is a question for Vince or Mr. Atkins. Do you know when your campaign or the judge's campaign saw those death notices?
I don't know that. I know the protest was on November 17th. And I'm sure they saw that list prior to the protest being filed. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm assuming,
They filed the protest on November 17th, but I think one of those people might, I think if I recall, one of those people died on November 17th.
November 5th.
yeah,
November 5th, election day.
Oh, that's right, that's right. So okay, I'm confused here. So you guys didn't receive it until November 17th, either the actual death.
I think it would have been at some point before that, since that was, I guess, the date of the.
I'm sure it was before
deadline,
the
I believe.
17th, because it took some time to gear up to
Yeah.
the protest.
I guess I'm just, so the Board of Election staff did not have availability to see it until 2 days after the election.
Correct. That's right. We, that would have been part of the weekly list maintenance. That in past elections, these list maintenance was done monthly. It just recently changed to weekly. And again, we were not used to doing list maintenance weekly because we had always been told not to change numbers once the
Right.
election had started. So we would process the election once it was over, then we would get back to our list maintenance.
These 6 voters, their votes were tallied and they were entered into the tabulation.
That's correct.
And the board did not have the opportunity to know, we're not aware of those things before canvas.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Anybody? John, do you have anything else to add?
Not at this point.
Nobody else has anything to add. So at this point, so basically, let me just remind everybody here. We only have one protest pending, and that is regarding the deceased registered voters. As Dawn mentioned, there were 5 who were deceased before election day, 1 on election day. I don't know that we have seen any documentation anywhere that a person who dies on election day, that person's vote won't count. Everything that I have seen in writing says by election day.
So I think this is maybe for deliberations.
Mhm.
So if they want to ask her questions first,
Yep.
that's probably the better.
Does anybody have
Way to
any
approach it.
questions for Dawn before we deliberate?
I do.
Okay.
You're saying, well, first of all, the one voter that died on the 5th is Owen Schumacher, for the record.
Okay.
You're saying the other 5 died prior to the election.
Before we
Have not
proceed,
been-
just to make sure we have the record preserved, Dawn, can I ask you to take your seat back over here again? And so can you use the podium? That way we're sure to get both people on the recording. I want to make sure we get everything.
Right.
That's fine. And the 5 other voters were not renewed prior to canvass.
Prior to canvass, no, they were not.
Okay. And had you done voter history on those voters?
Yes, we have.
Okay. I would like for the voter history, not the ballot, but the voter history to be entered into the record. And I don't know if you want separate exhibits for each one of them or the collective.
So do you have a copy of that? Or
I do
are you
not.
asking us to look it up and do it?
Right.
I'm assuming staff has that.
And when we say voter history, what,
We could go, to get voter history, we could go bring up that voter's record in, our SEAMS program and just, print off showing that they voted in the 11/5/24 election. And it will either show they voted early voting or absentee by mail.
and is that a public record?
It is a public record.
Okay. So you're asking for the county staff to search for and find a public record and then at some point in the future to put that in as a record as
That's my request.
For your evidence.
for your evidence.
For the evidence for the board, basically, it's substantiating what happened. So that it will justify the action the board may or may not take.
Well, I guess the question I'm concerned with here is, have you made that request before today?
No, I have not.
Okay. Well, it's unlikely we're going to be able to put that in the evidence today if the county staff has to go and
I understand.
find it. And then, so
Understand that.
we can fulfill the records request, but it's unlikely we're going to be able to do that and have it be a piece of evidence to be considered here today.
Okay. Then,
But we have testimony from Dawn that occurred. For our deliberation purposes, should be able to proceed
Well, you can consider whatever you'd like to consider. I'm just saying,
in his request.
right. I mean, as a matter of
I
just
understand.
practice, trying to get through that is going to be difficult.
And my understanding, just to note, is that last page of the packet that lists these challenge ballots actually indicates the date that they voted. That. So I think that's indicated there. I mean, and I guess it seems like my question would be, this protest seems to be about deceased voters, and what you're talking about would seem to be something that's more challenging voter eligibility in the first place.
I don't want to complicate things. And
Okay.
just as a point of order, can we have the names of the people read into the record who were deceased before the election and voted? And I think that'll
Yeah,
satisfy.
Dawn has that.
Dawn, if you have that, yes, you can read those.
I do. Ruth Cross, Timothy Wade Thacker, Edward Hugh McCluskey, Patricia Blakely Jones, Owen John Schumacher, and Michael Joseph Atkinson.
Dawn, but Owen John Schumacher, he was the one that died on election day, correct?
Correct. He was
Okay.
the one that passed the election day.
That's all I need.
That's it.
Okay.
I guess cross. Sorry, I'm struggling with trying to figure out how much formality we need here.
I don't think most of the procedural rules apply here, so I'm trying to make it any muddier than it needs to be. Just a few questions, and I just want to make a note that this is not about eligibility. These voters were eligible to vote. The question is whether they will continue to be counted in the totals. Can I just ask you to look at paragraph 16 of the affidavit again? Sorry.
And is this your witness's
Yeah.
affidavit? Or the affidavit of Mr. Bonifay?
This is the affidavit of Mr. Bonifay.
Okay.
This one?
Yes.
So this is just again procedural. It's I think the second to last page. Labeled page 3 just before the.
Okay.
It doesn't indicate whether or not the Board of Elections challenged any of these voters. From what I've heard, we're not aware of this until you received a protest, but we didn't have any reason to challenge them. So I just want to put that in the record as well. So let me just ask. Nobody on this list of 6 has been removed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you all will deliberate today to decide whether or not to remove any of those 6 units based upon your process and procedure, and whether or not believe you're following the guidance of what should or should not be done. So I'm going to ask the question. I don't think it actually makes sense at this point. Since you haven't removed anybody, there has been no process for deciding whether or not to challenge any given voter. We're going to discuss this today. Is that right? Okay. Thank you. So we've already read into the record the 6. I think it was already noted that Mr. Schumacher was the one that was counted as absentee rather than early voting. So his voted date would have been November 4th, and that date was actually election day. The other 5 were all early voting and would have been properly accepted. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I have for now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have, our first vote will be on facts and conclusions of law. So, as I remind you, it's our duty to make findings of fact about the one identified protest addressing the 6 contested ballots. And those findings must be based exclusively on evidence and the matter. So,
If I might suggest, before you talk about voting, it might be good to have a time for the board to deliberate and discuss what you've heard, what's been asked, what's been entered as evidence, and then think about what issues might still exist if you have any questions for anyone.
I was going to open up for discussion. So, since there's the three of us here, we have our forum, the welcome discussion from everyone about what Dawn has said, what the gentleman have presented to us.
So I just want to review. So we had 6 deceased voters. 1 died on election day, and the other 5 died prior to election day, but before and before canvass. And the list that we received was made available to us on November 7th. So we did not have an opportunity to,
When you say we, the Board of Elections staff received that notice, and we did not.
right.
Just for clarification.
Right. And so we as a board, county board, did not have an opportunity to act on these because we did not have the information.
For the reasons that Dawn cited earlier. Kevin?
So I have sort of dug into this since the protest was filed and the state board took what they took and kind of left us with the situation. And my concern, I guess, is just despite everything that is cited in the protester Judge Griffin's letter, as well as even the state guidance on this. I don't and have not found any language that actually strikes people's ballots just because they died on or before election day. The state provides guidance that it's supposed to be considered their status as of election day. The statute that they've cited is about where people live. So I don't really know that how material that is to whether that's actually when we're supposed to determine their status or not. The protester, Judge Griffin, cited a court case, Bouvier v. Porter, which really was not in this context. It was a libel case. The only connection I discerned from it was citing a statute that then cross-references another statute that says someone can be removed if they're dead, but then it does not specify that their ballots cannot be counted. What I also gathered from looking at the state's guidance is that what's supposed to be decided is, if these people were voted or eligible to vote on election day in a statewide race under all the statutes, whether it's early voting, absentee in the case of Mr. Schumacher, or otherwise, it's all based on their qualifications are based on whether they are qualified, presumably, at the time that they actually cast the ballot. And the only other interpretation I could read into this to the contrary is that in the statute, the state board memo cites for the proposition that we can only, we should consider status as of election day and not, as of the time that they cast the ballot, is the word resides. Be qualified to vote in the precinct in which the person resides. But, based on the context of the other language, my takeaway is that, they resided at the time at that place. So that was the place where they resides at the time that they passed the ballot. I don't see, unfortunately, and I think it's unfortunately or fortunately, to depending on who you are. I think this is something that the state could have easily fixed by passing a statute. They just passed the statute that's basically that went effective in July, which I think is when this list maintenance situation ended up changing. But there's nothing. They've gone to pains, it seems to me, to continually use the language prior to election day, prior to election day, prior to election day. And there's nothing about what if somebody is deceased on election day. I think so. For me, that discrepancy is kind of, they've gone to all these pains to emphasize it being prior. So the idea that we should read into a death on election day has been suddenly, being subject to challenge. I don't see that being there. And realistically, from everything that I had looked at, all these references on both sides, the state memorandum, I don't think the question has a resolution at this point in time.
I'm just going to go back to, I have one question. In the past, when we were given information about a voter being deceased prior to election day, and it came, okay, let me put it this way. If we had been given the information before canvass and it was presented to the board, whether or not to remove the voters who were deceased before election day, as memory serves me, and I've only been on the board for a couple of years now, but we would remove those voters up to election day. We've never had a voter. That's why I think we all looked up to see if we could see anything that said on election day, because everything said by election day. So in the past, when it came to our attention, you guys brought it to our attention. Every time that I can think of in the last 2 years, Homer, you've been here longer than I have, the board has voted unanimously to remove them from to essentially take away their vote, because that's what we have been told at state meetings, et cetera, is what we're supposed to do. So if that had been presented to me based on what we have done, I haven't poured into the law books, not something that I'm going by common sense and what we've done in the past. I would have voted for them to be removed. I would not have voted for Mr. Schumacher because, like I said a little bit earlier, there's nothing I had read in anything. I haven't done that exhaustive research, but all the memorandum, etc. I have not seen anything that said on election day. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm not as indecisive about it as you are, because you see all those different ways to move. The thing is, keep in mind, is that whatever we do, if it's not going to be enough we're one county out of 100. If it's not it's going to likely go to the State Board of Elections because it's a multi-county situation. And if it's not going to determine the outcome, it's not going to go forward. So I know where I stand. If I'd been given the evidence during canvass, I would have voted for those 5 unfortunate souls to have their vote removed, and I would vote for the gentleman, Mr. Schumacher, who had untimely demise on that day for his vote to count. So, Homer, I think it's going to come down to you.
And I guess I will just add, that I think the whole state really seems kind of like it's been operating off of this convention and custom and kind of not really nailed this down when I think it was easy to nail down.
I don't know that there's something that we can do here at this county board meeting to do that, but I have a feeling that when all these counties and this protest goes to the state, that we'll have more definitive result based on that. So that could be hopefully that'll be an outcome of this, not determinative of the election. So back
I
to you.
I don't want to insert myself if it's not requested, but if there's a question of law that the board would like to hear from me on, I'm happy to offer my opinion if you want to hear it.
Homer, I welcome it.
Sure.
I'll just point out that there does exist a statute 163-82.14 subsection B talks about death, and I'll read from that.
Okay.
The state board of elections shall distribute every month to each county board of elections the names on that list of deceased persons who were residents of that county. The Department of Health and Human Services shall base each list upon information supplied by death certificates it received during the preceding month. Upon the receipt of those names, each county board of elections shall remove from its voter registration records any person the list shows to be dead. Each county board of elections shall also remove from its voter registration records a person identified as deceased by a signed statement of a near relative or personal representative of the estate of the deceased voter. And it goes on. I don't know that necessarily is conclusive as to when votes should count or not be counted, but it does speak directly to the obligation of the state to provide a list and the obligation of the board to act on the list. So that at least somewhat is in comport with what your past practice has been and seems to support what you've done in the past.
And I, having reviewed that as well, I mean, I don't think there's probably any disagreement between us or for me that they need to be removed now. And I think that is a mandate.
You're getting your disagreement into
The only question I have is the lack of clarity about what's supposed to happen with the votes.
Understand.
Homer, with all that said,
Well, the memo that we got from the board on November 21st says that the question was, my county board has concluded that one or more of the voters brought into question by the protest should not have had their ballot counted. That is, they died before election day after voting early, but were not timely challenged by the board. How should my board proceed, and do they need to recanvass the election? And the answer that the state board legal staff said, no, do not recanvass or remove any ballots in considering these protests. And given that we did not receive timely notice, we couldn't act. And so my feeling is that we did not and now should not remove.
you say should not.
Yeah.
I think what that's referencing and is not that it's not that we should not determine that they should be ultimately removed. I
Right.
think that's what they're referencing is that we don't pull their votes now.
That's
Right.
correct.
Do you want to speak to that? Get it in a record why that is.
Well, we had been advised by the state not to pull any ballots, that the findings from today will be sent to the state board and then they will provide further guidance. If y'all, for any voters that y'all deem necessary to pull, if the ballot should have been pulled, we will send that findings to the state. And then at that time, when we're notified back from the state, they will give us guidance on how to proceed with the voters' ballot.
Basically, we did our recount and our numbers had to be a certain number. We couldn't have pulled those retroactively without proceeding through this and doing that. Is that what it's referring to more?
I'm not sure exactly what
Can I see it?
they just told by reading that we were just instructed not to pull any voters' ballots.
Right, and I understand that in terms of the process issue, but the reasoning behind it
Mhm.
indicates to me that it should go forward. As I understand and interpret what was behind their suggestion there,
What should go forward?
that we should not pull the votes.
Okay, all right, all right, can I just, okay. So do not recanvass or remove any ballots in considering these protests. If your county board concludes from evidence provided that a voter was not eligible to vote in the election and therefore their ballot should not have counted, then the board can make the conclusion there is substantial evidence to believe that a violation of election law or other irregularity or misconduct did occur and might have affected the outcome of the election. But the board is unable to finally determine the effect because the election was a multi-county election. The board does not retrieve the voter's ballot in these circumstances. Instead, when making that conclusion, the statute provides the following instruction. If the county board makes this conclusion, it shall order that the protest of the county board's decision be sent to the state board for action by it. So that is saying, the way I'm interpreting it is, we decide how we think it should proceed. If we would have done it, if given that evidence, we can conclude that that's where we stand, that 5 would not count, 1 would, and we make that recommendation, but we don't act on it. Our staff doesn't act on it. It's going to go to the state because there are 100 counties that might have the same protest, and they're going to see if it would make a difference in the outcome, et cetera, et cetera. If they'll have a bigger picture view on it than we do as individual counties. That's the way I'm reading that.
So our choice, based off of the statute they referred us to, is that we have the choice to forward it to them in that sense. We also have the choice to dismiss it.
Wait, that's the first thing is we have to vote on whether or not, there are 2 things we vote on. First, we vote on the finding of fact and conclusion of law in a written order. Dawn, do you have that written order template? That's basically saying, do we agree that their votes should count? Or do we agree that their votes should not count? And because the next thing that we have to do is the dismiss or not dismiss. So, when we do at the very end, we must fill out this form about our decision, about our findings of fact and the conclusions of law. They're 2 separate things. So what we're talking about right now is findings of fact. Do we believe that those 5 people, or actually the 6, do we believe that they all should not count? 5 should count and 1, or 5 shouldn't count and 1 should count, or none should count. That's what I'm thinking that's before us. If I'm totally wrong, please somebody here tell me.
I'll allow Rick to sort of speak finally to this.
Because the next step is the dismissal or not dismissal.
So the findings of fact, as I understand them, we are going to find the facts that were presented at this hearing.
Which basically Dawn has given us about what the board did.
And the conclusions of law are going to be the conclusions about basically justify the decision that we are going to make, that we would vote to make, whether it should be dismissed or sent on to the state board.
Yes.
I think but we would make the findings of fact, and that decision would be the conclusion of law. Part of it. That
Right,
we would
okay.
be voting
But
on
we have to put,
ultimately.
so we just need to decide. I'm looking here and we just need to decide. I'll give you, for example, here. Based on the evidence and testimony received by the county board finds that voters such and such whose eligibility was challenged by the protester does not have a ballot in the official count. So it's
Might I suggest before we get to that point, I would say that we need to talk about whether or not the protest was filed validly, whether or not we're going to agree to consider all the evidence that's heard here today. And then I would suggest that you look at each one of the challenged voters as an individual, even though I understand they kind of fall into some distinct categories.
Right.
I would make a specific finding as to the eligibility of each one of the voters. That way it's on the record.
Mhm.
We're happy to put the findings of fact and the eventual conclusion into a written order using the template that's been provided or modifying it as necessary. But I would look at each of them as an individual first, say what you think you want to say about each one, and then we'll talk about the conclusions at the end.
I agree with that. And that the state board's already advised us that the protest established probable cause to have this hearing. So we've heard from both sides. At this point, I mean, we could individually go through, but I want to hear from Homer first about how we interpret that particular thing. I'm interpreting that we basically decide on each of these people, does their vote count or their vote doesn't count. Ultimately, based on what we think, and considering it's likely to go to the state because it's a multi-county decision. It's not going to be our county owned. So I'll start with, do you want to go individually? Let me have those names. I'll just read off.
May I just make a comment?
Certainly, sir.
I hear what everyone's saying, and I just wanted to make a comment that may not help, but it may. The attorney, I'm sorry, your name is
Rick Stevens.
Rick Stevens. Talked about the whether or not a voter is eligible to vote before the vote has taken place. So this is not a matter of eligibility. These people were all eligible to vote. I just want to be on the record. The question is whether their vote should be pulled from the tally. And each voter will be reviewed individually and determine whether their individual vote should count.
Mhm.
Someone else had mentioned the notification. The data that gets pulled from the state is for maintaining registration rolls, which is separate from the individual votes. So that seemed like it was well understood. I just want to make sure that was clear on the record, because that's something that you had mentioned. That if somebody is to notify the board about a particular person's demise, that would come from their personal representative or a near relative, and that didn't occur. So whether there's a process for seeking this information other than maintaining the registration, that's separate from whether or not they consider an individual vote. So, I'm sorry if I'm
That's okay.
being pedantic. I just wanted to make that clear.
So,
Madam Chair, I would just suggest at this point, because we've allowed him to speak, I would suggest asking anyone else present if they want to say anything else before the board starts to take action.
okay, anyone else? Mr. Rankin?
Do you normally rely on the state board's representation that voters are deceased?
We do.
Okay, including your role.
We do that, and we also receive monthly voter deceased records from the register of deeds. And we maintain our rolls with that as well.
So is that still monthly? or
That's
is that also
monthly.
weekly?
That's monthly.
Okay.
We get those monthly.
If you did not receive information from the Register of Deeds office, would it be sufficient for you, the State Board of Education, excuse me, the education attorney, the State Board of Elections, indicated that they had deceased?
We do now check that the intranet weekly.
Okay.
Again, like I said, we did not check it.
But my question really is that alone sufficient for you to take somebody off the rolls, even
Yes.
if you don't get?
Oh,
information
yes,
from
yes, as long as the date of birth and all the information matches identical to the what we have on our record, we will remove that voter.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm looking at all these folks' date of death. 10/31, 10/29, 10/24, 10/29, 11/5, 11/3. Did not give a whole lot of time for notice for the process to go through, for you guys to be notified in the midst of getting ready for Canvas. So, okay. At this point, I think it's time that we at least initially go through these and determine if we think that that their vote, that we're recommending that their vote count or not count. And again, I'm going to say, based on what the attorney read to us, what practice has been, I know that I personally, if I had been given that information prior to Canvas, I would have brought it. I would have brought it to you all and said, "Is this something that we are going to pull? Are we going to pull these folks' ballots?" And in the past, we always have, except for somebody who's died on election day, and I don't know that that's happened. That this board or previous boards has dealt with. So, without any objection, I will go through these voters and we'll make a ruling on each.
And let me just clarify one thing, because I think this will help frame things for
Okay.
the board. If you find that any of these people are folks whose votes should be removed based on the fact that they did not seem to be eligible to have their vote counted based on their date of death, then that means that there is some substance to the protest and it should move forward. If the board were to decide that nothing should be done, there's no irregularities, everything was done correctly, then that would be the basis for a dismissal. Does that make sense? So as long as at least one of these people fits and comports with that, then that would mean this would go forward to the state.
So,
And that has to happen in its entirety. So let's say we agree Mr. Schumacher died on election day and we don't think that's legitimate, but people vote that the others are legitimate. The whole protest moves forward. Is that
I
how
think
it's supposed to operate?
the reason I was saying to vote on these individually is because even though it was one protest filed, there's individual voters and the circumstances might be different for each. So because of the fact that there could be a difference in the votes or the board's opinion as to how to handle each one, I would suggest doing them individually for that reason. And we only have 6.
yeah.
So it's not going to take too much longer to do it that way.
Okay. So first, I'm going to continue to go through this list, and we're going to determine whether or not each of these the ballot should be full. I don't know how to frame that.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we're going to go into should this protest be filed or dismissed? Is that what?
Why?
Because I think that I would say I think that there's because we would have acted in a certain way had we had this information. I am confident that we would have acted in a certain way, the way we have always acted. That if we had been given the information, then those would have been pulled, except for election day, the voter on election day. I think that part of the protest is legitimate and needs to go forward. So that's my take on it.
Well, that's certainly your opinion, and I think that's fine. And I think you're going to hear those in just a minute. I would just, again, like I suggested, I would just go down the list as to each one, and then
Make that statement.
have the board vote as to whether or not each one should be removed or not removed, and then we'll go forward from there.
All right.
I have a question. The state law is that if someone died before election day and there's evidence and fact that they did indeed die before election day, then their name should be pulled from tabulation for that election. That's what the state law
That's what the
says.
state law says.
So in my understanding from what I looked at and what Mr. Stevens read is that by maintenance, they're supposed to be pulled from the list of registered voters, not necessarily that their votes are supposed to be pulled.
But that's,
Yeah, I don't know that
Nuance.
the state law is quite as clear as what you just indicated it maybe should be.
Right.
But yes, I don't know that I necessarily think the state law says exactly what you said.
Mhm.
I agree with your board member's assessment in that there is an ongoing maintenance requirement of the lists. Registered voters are supposed to be culled from that list based on reports of death, either from DHHS or from trusted sources that are close to the person, like a near relative. But it doesn't speak directly as to whether or not the person's vote should count or not count based on whether or not in that state law.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
But that would be something that would be determined by the State Board of Elections if this goes to them, whether or not. It's going to be determined by them.
I think it's something we have to vote on for each person now. though.
Okay.
Right.
All right, let's move ahead and vote. Okay. I think we should deal first with the outlier, the one John Schumacher, whose death was on 11/5/2024. And Hummer, do you think his vote should be allowed based on what we discussed and what you've read?
I think that his vote should be allowed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
agree. Then Ruth Cross, who passed away.
Did you vote?
Yes, we did. All in
But you,
favor, aye.
you need
vote.
to formally.
You need
Yeah,
to vote. and
I
you need
did.
to-
I did. I agree. And so it's unanimous that Mr. Schumacher's vote will count. Ruth Cross died on 10/31, voted on 10/18. How do you vote?
Say that again.
She died on the 31st. Excuse me. Yeah, she died on 10/31, voted on 10/18. Do you think that her vote should count based on everything you've read and heard?
Based on everything that I've read and heard, and I'm going by the description regarding maintenance, and that we didn't get the information in time to act differently than the state made clear or informed us
Okay.
that vote should count.
You want it to count,
I want it to count.
okay?
I think it should count.
Okay. So, I vote no. I do not think it should count. And so that means that the board has voted that it should be allowed. Timothy Thacker died on 10/29, voted on 10/17. Same question, allow or not allow?
I say allow.
Allow.
I say no. So that one's allowed. Edward McCluskey, same question.
What are the dates again?
Died on 10/24, voted on 10/18.
I say allow.
Allow.
I say no. Patricia Jones died on 10/29, voted on 10/21. Hummer, same question.
I say allow.
Allow.
I say no. Michael Atkinson died on 11/3, voted on 10/22.
I say allow.
Allow.
I say no. Okay, so at this point, we have agreed as a board, majority has ruled that that all of these should be allowed to, their votes should be allowed to go forward. So that based on the evidence and the matters officially noticed. So we move on to voting on the conclusions of law listed in that NC General Statute 163-182.10.
Let me ask this question of
Yes.
the board. Maybe this will help. If the board has found no reason to believe there was any inconsistency based on the person's death status and the counting of those votes, because for each of them, the board voted to allow them to move forward. If there's no other question of eligibility as to any of those voters that's been raised by any of the evidence that's been presented today, then I would suggest that there's not a need to vote on the conclusions of law, but it's clear that there should be a dismissal because
Yeah.
all of these would be allowed to move forward.
Yes.
So
Again, exactly what he said, that our choices are to dismiss this protest because there's a lack of substantial evidence of any violation, irregularity, and misconduct sufficiently cast doubt on the results of the election. Or we can order that the protest and the county board's decision be sent to the state board of elections for action. So there's no action that's required. So do we hear a motion to dismiss the protest?
I move that we dismiss the protest.
Do we hear a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, do we hear a motion to adjourn?
I think we have to make the findings of that, so on the record, as to what was introduced, or we've sort of laid it all out there.
The findings
It
of
needs to be
fact were,
reduced to written order, I guess, at this point.
right, and that's
we have to write the report.
what I was gonna offer to do for the board is to present the board within the next couple. What's our timeline
We have
here?
a very short timeline on that.
Due by next week.
The 4th, I believe.
All right, so I guess I'm working this weekend. I'll get the board a proposed findings of fact, conclusion of law based on today's hearing. If there's no objection from the board, maybe you need to vote on this. I don't know that we need to formalize the findings of fact. I think we've heard the evidence presented. There wasn't any objection to the presented evidence that I heard. I'm happy to try to formalize that, present it to the board for you all to review before we would send it forward.
I think that would be much appreciated.
Do I hear a motion for Rick to take care of all that he just said?
I move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Sure.
Okay,
With thanks.
Yes. So
Thanksgiving, yes.
we appreciate you all coming, and good luck with your respective challenges ahead. And thank you to our board staff who put in overwhelming number of hours. And thanks to you guys, Board of Elections, being here, and to all of you. And with that, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.